The stagecoach ground to a halt in the middle of Dusty Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1883, and every soul on Main Street stopped what they were doing the moment Annie Prescott stepped down onto the sun-baked earth, clutching a worn leather suitcase in one hand and a secret in her heart that was heavy enough to bend a lesser woman clean in two. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, and had eyes the color of the sky just before a storm rolls in off the mountains, that particular shade of gray-green that made people uneasy without quite knowing why. She wore a traveling dress the color of deep plum that had seen better days, and her boots were dusty from 3 days of rattling roads that had nearly shaken her teeth loose. She stood on that wooden sidewalk and looked up and down the length of Dusty Creek, and for one honest moment, she let herself feel the full weight of everything she had left behind in St. Louis. Then she squared her shoulders, picked up her suitcase, and walked forward. Dusty Creek was the kind of town that existed in the crease between civilization and wilderness. It had a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Silver Spur, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though it had been listening too hard to the wind, and a sheriff's office with a roof that needed patching. There were maybe 400 people living within riding distance of the town square, most of them ranchers or miners or the families that held those lives together with thread and prayer. Annie had not come here by accident. She had come here because of a letter, written in a careful hand on paper that smelled faintly of cedar, from a woman named Mrs. Dolores Hatch, who ran the town's only boarding house and who had written to a placement agency in St. Louis looking for a school teacher. Annie had applied. Mrs. Hatch had accepted. And so here she was, with a teaching certificate from the St. Louis Women's Normal School tucked inside her suitcase alongside 2 dresses, a Bible, a photograph she kept face down, and a secret that she had carried so long it had started to feel like a second spine. The boarding house was easy enough to find. Mrs. Hatch was a round woman in her 50s with silver hair pinned up in an elaborate configuration that defied gravity and good sense both, and she came out onto her front porch the moment she saw Annie coming up the path. "You must be Miss Prescott," she said, and her voice was warm as fresh bread. "I am," Annie said. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Hatch. You look like you've been dragged behind that coach rather than riding in it," Mrs. Hatch said, not unkindly, and took the suitcase right out of Annie's hand with a strength that was surprising. "Come inside. I've got cold water and a meal waiting, and then you can sleep, and tomorrow the world will look considerably better." Annie followed her inside and decided she liked Mrs. Hatch immediately. The boarding house had 4 rooms for boarders. 2 were occupied by miners who worked the creek beds north of town. 1 was occupied by a young widow named Clara Taft who worked in the general store. And the last was now Annie's, a small room at the back of the house that looked out onto a kitchen garden where tomatoes were coming in red and heavy on the vine, and sunflowers stood sentinel along the fence line. Annie set her suitcase on the bed and did not open it that night. She ate the meal Mrs. Hatch brought her, drank the cold water, and lay down on top of the quilt fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally claimed her sometime around midnight. She started teaching at the end of that first week. The schoolhouse was a single room with 16 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and it smelled of chalk and old wood and the particular brand of restless energy that children generate when they are forced to sit still. Annie found, to her own relief, that she was good at this. She had always been good at the imparting of knowledge. It was the imparting of herself to another person that she had never quite managed without something going wrong. She had been in Dusty Creek for 9 days when she first laid eyes on Nathan Boone. He came into town on a Tuesday morning on a horse so dark it was nearly black, a big quarter horse with a wide chest and the disposition of something that had earned its peace. Nathan Boone was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the temples where sweat had dried. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone as the canyon walls east of town, and eyes the color of good whiskey warm amber shot through with bronze. He wore the worn leather and practical clothing of a working rancher, and there was nothing about him that performed or preened. He simply existed in his body the way the mountains existed in the landscape, entirely, without apology. Annie saw him from across the street, and she felt something shift in her chest like a lock turning, and she absolutely did not trust it. She had reasons not to trust it. She picked up her pace and went directly to the general store to purchase chalk for the schoolroom. Nathan Boone saw her too. He caught the flash of dark hair and a plum-colored dress moving purposefully through the small knots of people on Main Street, and he tracked her the way a man tracks a hawk crossing a wide sky, not consciously, but helplessly. He had not seen her before. He had been out at his ranch for 2 weeks managing a difficult calving season, and apparently while he was away, Dusty Creek had acquired a new addition. He went into Wilder's general store to collect a supply order and found her standing at the counter with a coin purse open in her palm and a slightly vexed expression on her face that suggested the price of chalk had personally offended her. Henry Wilder, who was 70 if he was a day and who had been running this store since before the railroad came within 3 counties, was watching her with the particular approval of a man who admires directness. "The price hasn't moved since last spring, Miss Prescott," Henry said. "I'm not saying it has. I am saying it should," Annie said. "Children go through chalk at a rate that would alarm you, Mr. Wilder, and if the school board expects me to supply my own classroom materials on the salary they are paying me, then the least this town could do is negotiate a reduced rate." "I'll tell you what," Henry said. "I'll throw in an extra box at no charge." "That," Annie said, "is considerably more reasonable." Nathan had been standing in the doorway for the better part of that exchange, and when she turned around to leave, she nearly walked directly into his chest. She pulled up short, and they were very close enough that he could see the gray-green of her eyes and the small scar on her chin that suggested a childhood with more adventure than she would probably admit to. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping back. Her voice was composed. The slight widening of her eyes lasted only a fraction of a second. "I didn't see you there." "No harm done," Nathan said. His own voice came out steadier than he felt, which was a mercy. "You must be the new schoolteacher." "Annie Prescott," she said, and extended her hand the way a professional woman extends a hand firmly, without ceremony. "Nathan Boone," he said, and shook it. "I run the Rocking Bee Ranch about 4 miles east. That's a long ride into town. Sometimes the reason makes it worthwhile," he said, and because the honesty of it surprised even him, he picked up the brim of his hat and stepped aside to let her pass, and Annie Prescott walked out into the sunshine with 2 boxes of chalk and a feeling in her chest that she told herself she could not afford. Nathan stood at the counter and placed his supply order and listened to Henry Wilder tell him about the new schoolteacher, where she had come from, what her qualifications were, how she had already charmed half the town in under 2 weeks, and he listened with more attention than he had given any conversation in quite some time. "She's got the manner of a woman who's carrying something," Henry said, not unkindly, in the thoughtful way of a man who has watched people come and go for half a century. "Something she hasn't set down yet." Nathan thought about that on the ride home. He thought about the steadiness in her eyes that had something careful behind it. He thought about the way she held herself composed and precise, like a person who has learned through experience that if you do not hold yourself together, things fall apart. He knew something about that. He had built the Rocking Bee from raw land over the course of 7 years. He had poured himself into it, every day that the sky was blue, and every night it was not, working alongside his 2 ranch hands, a seasoned older man named Pete Calloway who had been with Nathan since the beginning, and a younger man of 22 named Jesse Drum, who was half Ute on his mother's side, and who could read the weather and the land with a precision that Nathan had come to rely on absolutely. The ranch ran 300 cattle now, a remuda of horses, and a kitchen garden that Pete maintained with a dedication that was frankly touching. Nathan had built all of it, and it was good work, honest work, and the only thing that was missing from it was something he had not let himself look at too directly, because looking at it directly had not served him well in the past. He had been engaged to a woman named Helen Marsh, the sheriff's daughter, 3 years ago. Helen had been sweet and lovely, and ultimately not built for the life that Nathan's ranch demanded. She had gone back east to her aunt in Cincinnati, and Nathan had let her go without bitterness, because he understood that wanting someone to be something they were not was a particular kind of cruelty. He kept the ranch and his work and his 2 hands and his silence on the subject, and it had been enough. Until it wasn't. The second time he saw Annie Prescott, it was at the church social that Mrs. Hatch organized on the last Saturday of August. The whole town came to these things, or close enough to it, tables set up in the yard outside the leaning church, food brought by every household, children running between the legs of adults, fiddle music scratching out from the corner where old Archie Hayes played with the enthusiasm of a man who loves something more than he is technically skilled at it. Nathan came because Pete made him. Pete was 61 years old and had the social philosophy that a man who isolated himself too completely eventually became strange and no good to anyone, and he had been making this argument with increasing frequency. So Nathan came. He found Annie near the dessert table, in conversation with Clara Taft, who was the young widow from the boarding house. Clara was laughing at something Annie had said, and Annie was smiling, a real smile, not the composed professional expression she seemed to wear as a general matter of habit, but something unguarded and warm that changed her face entirely and made Nathan stop walking for a moment. He was still stopped when Pete appeared at his elbow and said, "Well, go say something." "I have said something," Nathan said. "We met in Henry's store." "Go say something else," Pete said, and walked off toward the fried chicken with the satisfaction of a man who has done his duty. Nathan got himself a cup of lemonade and waited until he was not being managed before he made his way in Annie's direction. Clara saw him coming and made a graceful excuse that was probably deliberate, and then it was just the 2 of them on the edge of the social, with the fiddle music and the children's noise surrounding them. "Mr. Boone," Annie said. "Miss Prescott." He looked out at the gathering. "Are you settling in all right?" "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Mrs. Hatch is extraordinary. The children are a genuine pleasure, even when they are not. And the landscape," she paused, looking out past the church to where the land opened up toward the mountains. I had not understood what it would look like. I had read about it, but reading is not the same. "No," Nathan agreed. "It never is." He looked at the mountains, too, the way he had looked at them for 7 years without losing the sense that they were something remarkable. "Where did you come from, if you don't mind?" "St. Louis," she said. A pause, brief but there. "I worked at a school there while I was studying for my certificate. When the position here came open, it seemed like a good time for a change." Something in the way she said it, the slight calibration in her tone, the way she did not quite fill in the whole story, made Nathan think of what Henry Wilder had said. "Something she hasn't set down yet." He did not push, that was not his way. "Do you have family in St. Louis?" he asked, which was a safer direction. "My mother passed when I was 16, she said, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has had years to make peace with a wound. "My father when I was 20. I have an aunt in Jefferson City, but we are not close." She turned and looked at him with those storm-colored eyes. "I am not without roots. I simply chose which ones to keep." "That's a brave thing," Nathan said. "Or a necessary one," she said. "They are not always different." They talked for another hour. Not deeply, nothing that scaled the walls she had built around her interior life, but comfortably, with a naturalness that surprised them both. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses, and the way the creek ran through the east pasture. She told him about the children, about a boy named Thomas who had already demonstrated a gift for mathematics that deserved better than a frontier schoolhouse, and about a girl named Rosa, the daughter of a Mexican ranching family, who was the fiercest reader Annie had ever encountered, and who had already worked through every book in the school's limited library. She needs more books, Annie said with a certainty that brooked no argument. Then she should have more books, Nathan said. I have a few at the ranch, nothing specialized but some history, a few novels. I'd be glad to lend them. Annie looked at him with an expression that he couldn't quite read, something considering, something that was deciding something. That would be very kind, she said. He rode out the following Friday with a parcel of books tied to his saddle. He left them at the boarding house with Mrs. Hatch because he did not want to presume and went back to his work. But Mrs. Hatch told Annie, and Annie found the parcel that evening, and she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the titles: A History of the Roman Empire, 2 novels by Thomas Hardy, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, and a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe, and felt the lock in her chest turn another fraction. She wrote him a note of thanks. He replied with a brief, honest letter. She replied to that. He rode into town 2 weeks later, and they talked in front of the boarding house for 40 minutes while the autumn light went gold around them. And neither of them noted when talking became the thing they were both looking forward to, which was the moment it became something else entirely. September gave way to October. The aspens on the mountain slopes turned the color of fire, and the air gained an edge that felt like a held breath before winter. Annie had been in Dusty Creek for 2 months, and she had found, to her own cautious surprise, that she was glad she had come. She was also terrified, in a way she kept private and managed alone, which was her long habit. Nathan began finding reasons to come into town more frequently. He needed supplies. He had business with Sheriff Marsh. He was checking on a horse he had left at the livery for shoeing. The excuses were thin enough that Pete Calloway, who said very little about most things, observed one afternoon while they were repairing fence line that Nathan had been into Dusty Creek more in the last 6 weeks than in the 6 months prior. I noticed that too, Jesse said from the other side of the fence post, driving a nail with the economy of a man who does not waste motion. I have business there, Nathan said. Pete and Jesse exchanged the wordless communication of men who have worked together in close quarters for long enough that they have developed their own language, and said nothing further. What Nathan could not quite reconcile was the feeling that there was a part of Annie that remained entirely inaccessible, and not in the way of ordinary privacy or natural reserve. It was something more specific than that. Something that sometimes looked out of her eyes when she thought no one was paying attention, a heaviness, a holding on. He had seen that look in people before, and it always meant there was something they were carrying that they had not yet found anyone trustworthy enough to hand to. He wanted to be that person for her. He did not entirely understand why yet, except that he had never wanted a thing more clearly or more peacefully in his life. It was the first week of November when things began to shift. A man arrived in Dusty Creek on a gray horse with a red-checked blanket roll, and he was asking questions about a woman traveling alone from St. Louis. He asked at the saloon first, which meant the information spread through town with the speed of a grass fire. Mrs. Hatch heard about it from Clara Taft, who heard it from one of the miners, and Mrs. Hatch went directly to find Annie. Annie was at the schoolhouse, alone after the children had gone, cleaning the blackboard. When Mrs. Hatch told her, the chalk eraser dropped from Annie's hand and she stood very still for 3 full seconds with her back to Mrs. Hatch, and Mrs. Hatch, who was a woman of considerable intuition, waited. "What does he look like?" Annie asked. Her voice was entirely level. That levelness, Mrs. Hatch thought, was itself a kind of answer. Gray horse, dark coat. They said he was a solid man, good-looking, maybe 35. He said he was looking for a relative. "He is not my relative," Annie said. "I didn't suppose he was," Mrs. Hatch said. "What would you like to do?" Annie turned around then, and her face had the look of a woman who has been waiting for something to catch up to her and has always known it would, and has made her peace with the running, and now must make her peace with the stopping. "I would like to think for a moment," she said. "Take all the time you need," Mrs. Hatch said. "He's at the Silver Spur. He won't know where you are tonight." Annie nodded slowly. Then she bent down and picked up the chalk eraser from the floor and finished cleaning the blackboard, because she was Annie Prescott and she finished what she started. Then she locked the schoolhouse and went back to the boarding house and sat in her room and opened the suitcase. The photograph she kept face down was a daguerreotype of a man who was handsome in the way of men who know they are handsome and use it as a tool. His name was Richard Calder. He was 36 years old, and he had been, for a period of 2 years, the employer of Annie's father before her father's death. And then, in the year after her father's death, the man who had pursued Annie with a persistence that she had initially been flattered by and then frightened of. He was wealthy and influential in St. Louis, and when Annie had refused his third proposal of marriage, this time with enough clarity that there could be no misunderstanding, he had not taken it with the grace she had hoped for. He had told her that she would regret it. He had told her in that quiet, particular way that was not quite a threat, but was close enough to one that she had understood it entirely. He had used his influence to make her situation in St. Louis difficult. He had spoken to the school board that employed her, not in ways that could be proven or directly named, but in ways that had resulted in her position being made untenable. He had, over the course of 6 months, made her feel cornered and watched, and without recourse. She had not told anyone. That was the secret, not a dramatic secret, not a criminal one, but the kind of secret that is its own particular weight. She was running from a man who had decided that his desire for her was more important than her own will, and she was alone with that knowledge, and she was tired of being alone with it. She had thought the distance of 600 miles and the anonymity of a frontier town would be enough. For 2 months, it had been. And now here was Richard Calder's emissary in Dusty Creek, and the question was what came next. She sat with the photograph for a long time. Then she turned it face down again and thought about Nathan Boone. She had been telling herself, very carefully and with great consistency, that she was not falling in love with Nathan Boone. She had a list of reasons. The primary reason was that she had not come here to fall in love with anyone. She had come here to build something solid and her own, something that could not be taken or threatened or made untenable by the designs of another person. Love, in her recent experience, was a thing that made you vulnerable in ways you could not fully anticipate, and vulnerability was something she was not currently in a position to afford. And yet, Nathan Boone sat with her letters for days before he replied, because she could tell by the thoughtfulness of his replies that he was not dashing them off. He had once ridden 4 miles in a thunderstorm to deliver a book that Rosa Gutierrez had been waiting for, and had refused to come inside because he was soaking wet and did not want to drip on Mrs. Hatch's floors. He said things that were simple and meant exactly what they said, which in Annie's experience was rarer than gold in this creek bed or any other. He had eyes that were warm and steady, and that rested on her with a quality of attention that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, genuinely seen rather than evaluated. She was falling in love with him. She had been falling for at least 6 weeks, and she had been managing it the way you manage a fever, with measured doses of practical thinking and distance, and telling yourself it would pass. It was not passing. The following morning, Nathan came into town for what was technically a supply run and actually an excuse to see Annie, and he was at Wilder's General Store when Sheriff Hank Marsh, a broad-shouldered man of 50 with a gray mustache and the measured manner of someone who has seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most of it, told him about the stranger. Asking after Miss Prescott, Hank said. Says she's a relative. She says he's not. Nathan felt something straighten in him, some instinct that was old and clear. Where is he now? Still at the spur, far as I know. He's being polite. I've got no cause to move him along yet, but I don't like the feel of it. Hank looked at Nathan with the particular expression of a man who knows what he sees. You might want to talk to her. Nathan left his supply order half completed and went directly to the schoolhouse. It was the lunch hour. The children were outside in the pale November sunlight with their food pails, and Annie was inside alone, sitting at her desk with her hands folded on its surface in the deliberately still way she had when she was working hard to maintain composure. She looked up when he came in, and for a moment her face showed something unguarded relief, and something more complicated than relief, and something he recognized as fear, though she was clearly refusing to call it that. "You heard," she said. "From Hank." Nathan came into the schoolroom and sat down in one of the student chairs, which was too small for him and creaked under his weight, and he looked at her directly. "Tell me." "It's not your problem," Annie said. "Tell me anyway," Nathan said, not pushing, just open. The kind of open that does not demand anything but offers a space. And Annie Prescott, who had not told a single person about Richard Calder in 6 months of carrying it, told Nathan Boone. She told it plainly and without embellishment. The proposals, the refusal, the quiet campaign of pressure and consequence, the reason she had left, the reason she had thought a frontier town 600 miles from St. Louis would be the end of it. She told it the way you tell something when you have been holding it alone for too long, and you have finally found someone solid enough to share the weight. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she was finished, the schoolroom was quiet except for the distant sound of children playing and the November wind brushing against the windows. "He sent someone to find you," Nathan said. "Yes." "Which means he has not let it go." "No." Nathan was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Unpack both." Annie looked at him. "I beg your pardon. The suitcase and the secret," he said. "You arrived carrying both. Unpack them, put them down. You don't have to carry either one alone anymore." It was not a grand declaration. It was not theatrical or ornate. It was said in the plain, direct way that Nathan said everything, and it hit Annie somewhere so far below her carefully maintained composure that she felt her eyes sting before she could stop them. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment and looked at the ceiling. "That is," she said carefully, "an unreasonably kind thing to say." "It's an accurate thing," Nathan said, "and I'm going to go talk to Sheriff Marsh this afternoon about what can be done if that's all right with you." "You don't have to, Annie." Her name in his mouth had a quality she was not prepared for, steady and warm and entirely sure. "Let me." She lowered her hand from her mouth and looked at him, and after a moment she nodded. Nathan went to see Hank Marsh. The conversation was useful. Richard Calder himself had not arrived, only his man, a hired agent of sorts whose name, when asked, turned out to be Dahlin. Hank Marsh went to the Silver Spur that afternoon and spoke to Dahlin in the measured, authoritative manner of a man who has a badge and knows how to use the weight of it without drawing a weapon, and made clear that Dusty Creek did not take kindly to strangers making inquiries about its residents, and that if Dahlin's business was what Hank suspected it was, the best outcome for everyone involved was for Dahlin to ride back the direction he had come. Dahlin was not a foolish man. He was pragmatic. He looked at the sheriff, did the calculation, and the following morning he left Dusty Creek on his gray horse heading east. It was not the end of the problem, and all four of them, Nathan, Annie, Hank Marsh, and Mrs. Hatch, who had appointed herself Annie's general, knew it was not the end. Richard Calder was a man with resources and a certain quality of pride that did not accept defeat. Dahlin going back empty-handed would not conclude the matter. It would only delay it. But on that particular Wednesday evening in early November, with Dahlin gone, and the stars coming out over the Colorado plains in their enormous quantity, Annie stood on the back porch of the boarding house and breathed in the cold air and felt, for the first time in many months, that she was not entirely alone with what she was carrying. Nathan came to call the following Sunday. He came formally, in the way things were done. He had spoken to Mrs. Hatch, who was the closest thing Annie had to family in Dusty Creek, and asked if it would be appropriate to take Annie riding in the afternoon if she was willing. Mrs. Hatch had conveyed the invitation with a pleased expression she did not bother to conceal. Annie had said yes. He brought a gentle mare named Clover for her, because he had watched her on Main Street long enough to know she was not an experienced rider, and he was not going to put her on anything that required expertise. she did not claim to have. That consideration, the simple, practical thoughtfulness of it, struck her as more significant than any number of romantic gestures would have been. They rode east from town toward the Rocking Bee, not going all the way. The afternoon was short and the air was cold, but far enough that the town fell away behind them, and the land opened up into the extraordinary emptiness of the Colorado plains, with the Rockies rising on the western horizon, snow on the highest peaks now, catching the November light and throwing it back in colors that did not have adequate names. Annie pulled Clover to a walk and looked at it for a long time. "I grew up with the Mississippi 2 blocks from our door," she said. "I always thought that was what grandeur looked like. Enormous and brown and going somewhere." She looked at the mountains. "This is different. This is grandeur that isn't going anywhere. It's just there, permanent." "Most days that's a comfort," Nathan said. He was watching her watch the mountains, and he was aware that he was doing it, and aware that it was a significant thing to have become this aware of a single person in this way. "Some days it's a reminder." "Of what?" "That whatever you're dealing with is smaller than it feels," he said. "The mountain was there before the problem. It'll be there after." Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are a surprisingly philosophical rancher, Mr. Boone." "Nathan," he said. She looked at him. The wind moved a strand of dark hair across her cheek, and she did not bother to push it away. "Nathan," she said, and it felt like something agreed upon, like a door opening that they both stepped through at the same time. They rode back to town as the light went copper and rose along the western edge of the sky, and Nathan walked Annie to the boarding house door and held the brim of his hat and said, "I'd like to do this again if you're willing." "I'm willing," Annie said, and went inside. That was the beginning of what became the primary fact of both their lives through the rest of November and into December, the courtship of Annie Prescott and Nathan Boone, conducted in the open, unhurried manner of two people who had both been hurt before and were not going to rush anything, but who were also, at the same time, completely unable to stop. They rode together on Sundays when the weather allowed. They talked in front of the boarding house in the evenings when Nathan had reason to be in town. He began attending the church social with her, which Pete noted with deep personal satisfaction. She began making visits to the Rocking Bee, accompanied by Mrs. Hatch in the early weeks, and then, as December arrived and the formalities eased into friendship, and then into something more honest than that, alone. She met Pete Calloway, who shook her hand firmly and said, "He's been better since you came," with the bluntness of a man who considers his age an excuse to say whatever he thinks. She met Jesse Drum, who was quiet and watchful, and who told her with a kind of measured directness that she did not expect that he thought she was right for this place, which she took as the highest possible compliment from someone who read the land for a living. She saw the ranch in its fullness, the cattle in the winter pasture, the horses moving in the paddock in the cold morning air sending breath plumes into the sky, the kitchen that Pete kept warm and functional, the main house that Nathan had built with his own hands over the course of 2 winters, solidly made, modest but not sparse, with a fireplace that drew well and windows that faced west, so the sunset came in every evening like a benediction. She stood in front of those windows one afternoon in mid-December, while Nathan was outside with Jesse attending to something urgent with one of the cattle, and she looked at the mountains going pink in the failing light, and she understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and entirely peaceful that she was in love with Nathan Boone and had been for some time, and that the question was no longer whether she was going to allow it, but whether she was going to be honest about it. Which was an entirely different and harder question. She was still standing at the window when Nathan came back inside, stamping cold from his boots, and he came to stand beside her and look at the same view. "Pete called it the best window in the county when I put it in," he said. "Pete was right," Annie said. She turned to look at him. He was very close, and the firelight was behind her and the fading daylight was in front of him, and they were both at the edge of the thing they had been approaching for 2 months. "Nathan." "Yes," he said quietly, not answering a question, just acknowledging her here, present. "I am not easy," she said. "I want to say that clearly because I think you should know it before." She stopped. "Tried again. I have been careful for a long time. I have kept myself at a certain distance from things because I have found that when I do not, I end up carrying the consequence alone. And I am tired of carrying things alone, but I am also not sure I know how to stop." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You told me about Richard Calder." She blinked. "Yes. You kept that alone for 6 months," he said. "You told me in one afternoon, so I think you do know how to stop. I think you are just afraid it won't hold." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you to trust that it will." Annie was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled behind her. Outside, the mountains had gone from pink to deep violet against a darkening sky. "I think I am already in love with you," she said, quiet and even and honest, "which frightens me considerably." "It frightens me too," Nathan said. "I'd say that's a fair indication that it's the real thing." He reached out and tucked the strand of dark hair that was always falling across her cheek back behind her ear, and his hand lingered for a moment against her temple, and Annie turned her face slightly into it. And they stayed like that in the firelight while the Colorado winter closed around the house, and neither of them was afraid, precisely. But both of them understood that something permanent was being decided. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. They would debate this afterward with the gentle humor that became characteristic of them. And it was the kind of kiss that does not feel like a beginning but like a recognition, like something that has always been true finally being said aloud. Christmas in Dusty Creek was a community affair. The town put up a tree in the square, and there was a service at the Leaning Church and food at the town hall that had been contributed by nearly every household within riding distance. Nathan brought Annie and they sat together in the pew with their arms close enough that the warmth of it was a constant small fact. And Mrs. Hatch sat on Annie's other side with the expression of a woman whose confidence in her own matchmaking has been vindicated. Annie had received a letter from her aunt in Jefferson City, the one she was not close to, expressing surprise that Annie had gone so far west. She had written back with a description of the mountains and the town and the children, and had mentioned Nathan in 2 careful sentences that conveyed rather more than 2 sentences typically would. She had not yet written to anyone in St. Louis, because she was still not certain what she would say, and because the question of Richard Calder was not resolved. It was resolved, or rather, it arrived, in January. Richard Calder himself came to Dusty Creek on a cold Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of January 1884, and he came alone this time, on a well-bred roan horse, wearing a coat that was expensive enough to be conspicuous in a frontier town, and he asked at the livery where he could find Annie Prescott. The livery man, whose name was Frank Dunn, told him she was at the schoolhouse, and then went immediately to find Nathan Boone, who happened to be in town that morning for the first time in a week because the winter had kept the roads difficult. Nathan found out at the same time as Sheriff Marsh. They walked to the schoolhouse together, which was perhaps not precisely protocol, but Hank Marsh was a practical man, and he appreciated having Nathan with him, because Nathan was someone who understood what was at stake in a way that a stranger could not. Richard Calder was standing outside the schoolhouse when they arrived, and he was better looking than Nathan had expected from Annie's description. Not that she had said he was handsome, but there was an ease in his bearing and a quality of assurance in his face that Nathan recognized as the particular confidence of a man who has almost always gotten what he wanted. He was looking at the schoolhouse door with the expression of a man who is deciding how to play the next moment. He looked up when Nathan and Hank approached. His eyes went from the badge on Hank's coat to Nathan with a quick calculation. "Richard Calder," Hank said. "That's right," Calder said pleasantly. "And you are the sheriff, I take it. I'm looking for an old friend. I'm told she teaches here." "An old friend who moved 600 miles away and didn't leave you an address," Nathan said. He kept his voice level. He had decided in the walk over that he would be level. He was not going to give this man anything theatrical to react to. Calder looked at him with the particular attention of someone sizing up an opponent. "You have me at a disadvantage. I don't know your name." "Nathan Boone," Nathan said. "I'm Annie's." He paused just briefly and then chose the word that was most accurate and most clear, her intended. It was the first time he had used that word. It was also, he was aware, a word that required a subsequent conversation with Annie, and he was prepared to have it. But right now, in this moment, it was the word that needed to be said. Something moved across Calder's face, surprise, and something harder under it, something that had not accepted the outcome it was being presented with. "Annie and I have a long history," he said. "I know what your history with her is," Nathan said. "She told me." Another calculation in Calder's eyes. "She is a grown woman and can make her own choices." "Yes," Hank Marsh said with the weight of his badge and his 50 years and his considerable patience. "She can, and she has. Now, Mr. Calder, I'm going to say what I said to the man you sent here in November. Annie Prescott is a resident of Dusty Creek. She is under the protection of this office. She has not indicated any wish to see you, and I'm not going to allow you to go in there and disrupt her school day. What I am going to do is give you the opportunity to ride back the way you came and consider whether this is truly how you want to spend your time and your resources." The schoolhouse door opened. Annie stood in the doorway. She had heard voices she recognized and voices she did not expect, and she had made the decision that had always been her strongest quality. She did not hide. She was pale, but she was standing straight, and her eyes moved from Hank to Nathan and rested there for a moment with an expression of something complicated and moved before she looked at Richard Calder. "Richard," she said, steady. "Annie." And his voice, for the first time, had something in it that might have been genuine, a tiredness, an honesty. "I only wanted to see that you were well." "I am exceptionally well," Annie said. "Better than I have been in longer than I want to admit. And I am asking you, as I have asked you before, to let me be well in peace." Calder looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Nathan, standing beside Hank Marsh with the particular quality of stillness that is not passivity, but its opposite, something coiled and clear and entirely committed. He looked back at Annie. Something shifted in his face. Not defeat exactly. Something more like the recognition of a boundary, finally real enough to be accepted. He was a man who had not often been told no in ways that held, and he had convinced himself, perhaps, that persistence would eventually wear through. But looking at Annie Prescott standing in the doorway of her schoolhouse in Dusty Creek, Colorado, with a schoolroom full of children behind her and a man beside the sheriff who looked at her the way Nathan Boone looked at her, Calder understood, in the way a sensible man eventually understands things, that this particular story had already ended, and it had ended without him. "I wish you happiness," he said. "It came out true enough." "Thank you," Annie said. "Safe travels." He rode out of Dusty Creek that afternoon. Nathan watched him go from the end of Main Street and then turned and walked back to the schoolhouse, where Annie was standing in the doorway again, and her composure had cracked slightly at the edges in the way that composure does when the crisis is over, and the body finally allows itself to feel what it was too busy to feel during the crisis itself. Nathan came up the 2 steps and stood in front of her and opened his arms, and Annie walked into them and pressed her face against his chest and let herself shake for about 30 seconds, which was all she gave herself, and he held her and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. Then she stepped back and looked up at him and said, "You called yourself my intended." "I did," he said. "That requires a question to have been asked," she said. "It does," he said. "I was getting to it." He looked at her, the winter light, her storm-colored eyes, the specific and particular way she existed in the world, all of it landing on him at once in the way it always did, with a force that felt like sunlight coming through a break in cloud cover. "Annie Prescott, will you marry me?" Annie was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the gap between the schoolhouse and the fence and made a low sound that was almost music. "Yes," she said, as simply as that. He smiled, the full one that he did not show often, that went all the way to his amber eyes, and she smiled back. the unguarded one that changed her face, and he kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth. And from inside the schoolhouse came the sound of one of the older children saying "you" with enormous conviction, which broke them apart laughing, and Annie smoothed the front of her dress and said she had to get back to her class, and Nathan went to find Pete Calloway to tell him. Which was both the announcement he most wanted to make, and the one Pete had clearly been waiting for longest. They were married in April of 1884, on a Saturday when the aspens were coming green, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the whole of Dusty Creek turned out for it because, in a town of 400 people, a wedding is a community event, and everyone has opinions about which dress and whose flowers, and whether the reception should be at the town hall or at the churchyard. And Mrs. Hatch managed all of it with the iron hand and warm heart that characterized everything she did. Annie wore a dress the color of cream with a ribbon the color of the sky, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Jesse Drum had found blooming early on the south slope of the hills east of the ranch, and she walked up the slightly tilted aisle of the leaning church on the arm of Henry Wilder, who was the closest thing to a paternal figure that Dusty Creek had unanimously agreed upon. And she looked at Nathan waiting for her at the front and thought, not for the first time, how impossible it would have seemed 6 months ago that any of this could be real. Nathan looked at her coming toward him and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for longer than he could honestly track, something that was not merely the relief of happiness arriving, but the deeper ease of a person finding the place they were meant to be and the person they were meant to be it with. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Cole, a young minister from Ohio who approached his calling with a sincerity that sometimes outpaced his eloquence, but who got the words right where it mattered. Nathan said what he meant when he said the vows, slowly and clearly, looking at Annie directly, and Annie said what she meant in return in a voice that did not waver, and the congregation, who had been holding its collective breath in the way that wedding congregations do, let it out all at once in the quiet way of people moved. Afterward, the reception ran until the stars were out, and then considerably beyond that, with Archie Hayes playing his fiddle with enthusiasm that may not have been perfect but was entirely heartfelt, and Pete Calloway dancing with Mrs. Hatch in a manner that suggested the two of them had been spending more time together than anyone had noticed, and Jesse Drum sitting on the fence rail watching the stars with the quiet contentment of a man at peace with the world. Clara Taft cried twice, both times discreetly. Young Thomas, the mathematically gifted boy from Annie's class, was found asleep under the dessert table at 10 o'clock and carried home by his father without waking. Annie and Nathan left the celebration and rode out to the rocking bee together under a sky so full of stars it seemed extravagant, and Annie looked up at them from the back of Clover and thought that this was what it felt like to have put the suitcase down. Both of them, the physical one and the other kind. She had, in fact, unpacked the suitcase in the literal sense the day before the wedding, moving her things into the room of the ranch house that would now be hers as well as Nathan's. She had done it methodically, hanging her dresses on the hooks, arranging her books on the shelf he had built and installed along the east wall specifically for that purpose, placing her teaching certificate on the small writing desk by the window. And the photograph of Richard Calder, she had held it for a moment, and then she had put it in the wood stove and watched it curl and go, not with drama, not with ceremony, simply as the completion of something that had been waiting to be completed. The spring was extraordinary. Annie continued teaching, which had never been in question. Nathan had not once suggested she ought not to, and she would have found a way to be both clear and gentle about it if he had, but he had not. He understood that her work was as much a part of her as the ranch was a part of him, and the ranch was large enough in the life they made together to hold both things. She rode out to the rocking bee each afternoon after school. She learned to handle Clover confidently, and then, by May, she graduated at Jesse's instruction to a horse named Scout, who had more spirit but responded to a steady hand. She helped Pete in the kitchen garden when the planting season came, which Pete initially protested and then accepted with relief, because his knees were giving him trouble and the tomatoes needed attention. Nathan came to the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons when he could, and sat in the back row in one of the student chairs that was too small for him, and listened to Annie teach the last lesson of the week, which was almost always something she cared about enough to invest with real feeling: a poem, a piece of history, a scientific observation about the natural world. He found, watching her teach, that he understood her better than he could have by any other means. She came most fully alive when she was sharing knowledge she cared about with people who deserved it. Rosa Gutierrez finished all the books Nathan had sent. Annie wrote a letter to a bookseller in Denver and ordered a careful selection with her own money and Nathan's combined, and the box that arrived 6 weeks later was, according to Rosa, the finest event of the entire year, which Nathan thought was possibly an overstatement but Annie thought was not. In June, Pete Calloway came to Nathan with the expression of a man who has something to say and is not entirely certain how it will land, and told Nathan that he and Mrs. Hatch had been keeping company quite seriously for several months, and that he was going to ask her to marry him. And what did Nathan think? Nathan told him he thought it was the best news he had heard since the last piece of best news, and Pete went and asked Mrs. Hatch, and she said yes without apparent deliberation. And Dusty Creek had its second wedding of the year in August, smaller than the first but no less joyful. Mrs. Hatch moved out to the rocking bee, which she approached with the energy of a woman who has found a project worthy of her gifts, specifically, the ranch house kitchen, which she overhauled with an enthusiasm that Pete found occasionally alarming and ultimately deeply welcome. The boarding house she left in Clara Taft's capable hands, which turned out to be exactly where it needed to be. By October, Annie knew she was expecting their first child. She told Nathan on a Sunday evening, sitting together by the west-facing window with the mountains going purple in the last light, in the particular way of autumn when the air is clear and everything has a sharpness to it. She had been carrying the knowledge for 3 weeks, adding it to the evidence, making sure before she said it because she was Annie and she made sure of things. Nathan was very still for a moment when she told him, and then he turned from the mountains to look at her, and his face had an expression she had not seen before, something open and undone and entirely happy, in a way that stripped away every layer of the composed, capable man he was and showed something underneath that was just Nathan, just the core of him, unguarded. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I feel entirely fine," she said. "I feel extraordinary, in fact." He put both arms around her and pulled her close, and she felt his breath against the top of her head and his heartbeat under her ear, and the fire crackled, and the mountains were purple and then black, and Mrs. Hatch was making something in the kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and good sense, and Pete was somewhere outside with Jessie checking the late-season cattle, and all of it was real and warm and hers. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was hard in the way that Colorado winters are hard, not cruel but relentless, the snow coming in waves, the cold settling into the land and staying. The rocking bee managed it well. Nathan had prepared thoroughly. The hay stores were deep, the cattle were sound, and the house was warm with people who cared for each other. Annie's aunt from Jefferson City wrote in December to say she was planning to visit in the spring, which was the first real movement toward each other they had managed in years, and Annie wrote back with welcome that was genuine if measured, because she and her aunt had the particular relationship of two people who love each other from a distance and are learning to discover whether that distance is necessary or simply habitual. She continued teaching through February, when Dr. Alderman, the town's physician, a small, precise man from Philadelphia, who had come west a decade ago for reasons he declined to specify, but which seemed to involve an indeterminate personal transformation, told her she should probably reduce the physical demands somewhat, and Annie modified her routine accordingly, while maintaining that she was perfectly capable of teaching fractions and state capitals in any condition whatsoever, which Dr. Alderman accepted because she was correct. The baby was born in late April of 1885, on a morning when the last of the mountain snow was softening, and the creek was singing loudly over its stones. He was a boy, solid and certain from his first breath, with Nathan's dark hair and Annie's storm-colored eyes, and they named him James Calloway Boone, James for Annie's father, and Calloway for Pete, who received this news outside the bedroom door with a silence that lasted so long that Mrs. Hatch patted his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and neither of them said anything, because some things do not require words. Nathan held his son for the first time and looked at Annie, who was tired and luminous in the way of women who have accomplished something enormous, and he said, "He is the most remarkable thing I have ever seen." "He has your eyebrows," Annie said, with a fondness that made Nathan laugh, the full one, the one that went all the way to his eyes. "That is a heavy burden," Nathan said. "He'll grow into them," Annie said. Young James was, from the very beginning, a robust and curious child who gave the impression of a person in a considerable hurry to understand everything about the world and slightly impatient with the pace at which the world was explaining itself. He rolled over at 4 months, stood at 9, and was walking by 11, careening through the ranch house with the focused recklessness of a person who has decided that falling is a fee worth paying for the freedom of movement. Pete, who had been the practical soul of this ranch for 7 years, became the most consistently devoted presence in James's daily life outside of his parents. The kind of grandfather figure that is not blood but is entirely real, who knows which songs settle a fretful child and which games develop into necessary skills, and when to hand the child back to his mother for the things that only mothers can provide. Jesse Drum, who had watched the whole arc of these last 2 years with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had known from early on how things would go, taught James to identify birds by their calls before the boy could properly form sentences, which Nathan thought was perhaps setting the educational priorities slightly unusually, and Annie thought was absolutely perfect, because the wild world was a text worth reading as early as possible. In the summer of 1885, Sheriff Hank Marsh retired and his deputy, a capable young man named Gil Torres, took the badge. It was a smooth transition, aided considerably by Hank's thorough and generous handoff, and Gil Torres proved himself sound within the first month by handling a territorial dispute between 2 ranching families with a calm and fairness that set the tone for his tenure. Annie's Aunt Vera arrived from Jefferson City in June as promised, and turned out to be, on closer acquaintance, a more interesting woman than the formal letters had suggested, sharp-minded and dry in her humor, with opinions about nearly everything that she delivered without apology, and a genuine delight in young James that she expressed by picking him up and talking to him directly at eye level, as if he were a small colleague rather than an infant, which James apparently found appropriate and responded to with enthusiasm. Vera stayed for 3 weeks, long enough to see the ranch in its summer fullness and to sit at the supper table several evenings and understand, in the way of a perceptive woman, who Nathan Boone was and what he had given her niece. On her last evening, she said to Annie privately that she was glad that she had worried about Annie, in the quiet way of family members who do not know how to say the worry while it is happening, and that what she saw here was a woman who had found what she needed and built what she wanted, and that was not a common thing and she should know the value of it. Annie told her she knew. The ranch grew through 1885 and into 1886. Nathan added 20 acres on the eastern edge, expanding the winter pasture, and hired a third hand, a steady young man of 23 named Theo Briggs, who came up from New Mexico and who learned the rhythms of the rocking bee with a quiet diligence that everyone appreciated. Jesse Drum, who had been an informal foreman for years, was formally given that role with an increase in pay that Nathan had been meaning to provide for some time, and Jesse received it with the same calm dignity he brought to most things. Thomas, the mathematically gifted boy from Annie's school, completed everything she could teach him by the spring of 1886, when he was 14. Annie wrote a letter to the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, a letter that took her 4 careful drafts to get right, describing the boy's abilities and his family's limited means, and asking whether there were paths by which a student without resources might access the kind of education his abilities deserved. The school wrote back, and the correspondence that followed resulted, over several months, in a partial scholarship arrangement that covered Thomas's board if his family could manage the travel cost. The ranching community of Dusty Creek raised the travel cost over a single Saturday afternoon social, which was perhaps the most efficient collective act the town had ever performed. Thomas left for Golden in September of 1886, 14 years old, and carrying a battered leather satchel and an expression of barely contained excitement that Annie recognized as what she must have looked like arriving in Dusty Creek with her suitcase 3 years before. She stood on the platform with his mother, a small, capable woman named Maria who had worked harder for her children than most people work for anything, and they watched the stage carry him away, and Maria squeezed Annie's hand and did not say thank you because it was too large for a phrase, and Annie squeezed back and understood. Rosa Gutierrez completed the school the following year, at 15, and went to Santa Fe to live with cousins and continue her education at a school there. Before she left, she came to Annie with a bundle of 12 books tied with string, the ones Nathan had originally sent, and the ones from the Denver order, and several others she had acquired over the intervening years, and said she wanted to leave them for the next student who needed them, which was the most useful and considered gift the school had ever received. The years that followed had the quality of good years, not without difficulty, because no real life is without difficulty, but with the kind of difficulty that is navigable when you face it with the right people. Cattle prices fluctuated in 1887, which made a tight year that Nathan managed by selling 3 horses at good prices and holding expenses close. A drought threatened the summer of 1888, but broke in August before the real damage set in, leaving the creek muddy but running, and the pastures recovered enough by fall that the losses were smaller than they had feared. James Boone grew from rolling and walking and talking into running and climbing and arguing, and eventually into the particular creature that a ranch boy becomes at 6 years old, part capable, part hazard, entirely alive, with dirt on his face most hours, and an opinion on every subject that he had not yet learned to moderate. He was sunny-natured like his father, and precise-minded like his mother, and entirely his own person already, which Annie found the most astonishing and wonderful thing about parenthood, that you could love someone so completely and still be surprised by who they turned out to be. In late 1888, Annie was expecting again. This time it was a daughter, born in March of 1889, whom they named Clara Rose Clara for the young widow from the boarding house, who had been Annie's first friend in Dusty Creek, and who was now running the boarding house with the same energy Mrs. Hatch had brought to it, and Rose for the simple fact that the roses along the ranch house fence had come early that year, and the name felt right. Clara Rose had Annie's dark hair and Nathan's amber eyes, and from an early age, a temperament that combined her mother's precision with her father's steadiness, in a proportion that suggested she was going to be formidable in whatever direction she chose to aim herself. She and James developed the particular relationship of siblings where they argued constantly about things that did not matter and formed an unbreakable alliance on things that did, which Nathan considered the ideal sibling relationship, and Annie considered typical of human beings in general. Mrs. Hatch remained at the rocking bee and declared herself entirely satisfied with this outcome. Pete's knees deteriorated through 1889 to the point where the heavy ranch work was beyond him, but he managed the kitchen garden with undiminished dedication and remained the moral authority of the ranch household, in a way that required no physical exertion, only the occasionally raised eyebrow and the well-timed silence, both of which he deployed with precision. Jesse Drum, as foreman, had become someone the whole community turned to for information about land and water and weather, and he was regarded in Dusty Creek with the uncomplicated respect that comes from years of being consistently right. He had found, in the years since Annie and Nathan's wedding, a quiet life that suited him, a small house on the ranch property that Nathan had built for him, a correspondence with his Ute relatives to the northwest that kept him connected to his mother's people, and the deep satisfaction of work that mattered done well. In 1890, Dusty Creek got a telegraph office, which shrank the distance to the world outside in a way that felt significant. Annie sent a message to her Aunt Vera in Jefferson City to celebrate, and Vera replied within the day, which was itself remarkable enough to be worth noting. Thomas wrote from Golden. He had completed his technical training and was being considered for a position with a mining engineering firm in Denver. He wrote that he owed Annie his mathematical education, and she wrote back that he owed himself his mathematical education, which was the more accurate statement, and that she was proud of him in a way that was not pride exactly, but something more like the particular satisfaction of watching a good plant grow in good soil. Nathan and Annie sat together by the west-facing window on the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, April 1890, and James was in bed and Clara Rose had just that week learned to sit up steadily on her own, and was asleep in the small room that had been made into a nursery. And the mountains were doing the thing they always did in the last light, going from gold to rose to violet in a progression that still had the capacity to stop conversation. "I have been thinking," Annie said, "about what this place looked like when I arrived." "What did it look like?" Nathan said. He had his arm around her and she was leaned against his side and they were both looking at the mountains. "Like nothing I had expected," she said. "Like something that could hold me." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so afraid." "Of what specifically?" "Of all of it," she said. "Of being here, of being wrong about running, of being right about running and finding nothing worth running toward." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Of you." "Of me," he repeated. "You were terrifyingly easy to love," she said. "That is more frightening than the complicated kind you can manage. The easy kind just takes you." Nathan looked at her for a long time, the firelight and the mountain light and the fullness of 6 years in his eyes. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. She turned and kissed him, there in the evening light, and he kissed her back with the thoroughness of a man who has not stopped being glad of every day of this. And outside the rocking bee, the Colorado evening was doing its quiet and magnificent work. The year 1891 brought a good cattle season and a harder winter, and Nathan and Jesse spent the worst weeks of January rotating the herd through the barn pasture and the sheltered draws, and Theo Briggs proved himself indispensable in those weeks in a way that sealed his permanent place at the ranch. Pete baked bread most mornings that January to keep the kitchen warm and the household spirits elevated, which was an excellent strategy, and Mrs. Hatch made decisions about the household provisions with the executive authority of someone who takes infrastructure seriously. James turned 6 in April of 1891 and began at the school, which was now taught by a young teacher named Miss Elise Ford, who had come from Kansas City the previous year in circumstances not entirely unlike Annie's own, though without the particular complication of Richard Calder. Annie had helped her settle in with the directness and generosity that comes from knowing what it is to be new and unknown in a place, and Miss Ford had turned out to be excellent with children and competent in the classroom, and James had come home after his first week declaring her satisfactory, which was James's highest available praise. Annie had stepped back from teaching when Clara Rose was born, which she had done with the full knowledge that it was a temporary step and that she would find the work again in another form. She was not wrong. By 1891 she was teaching again, not at the schoolhouse, That was Miss Ford's domain, and Annie respected it. But at a Friday afternoon session, she organized at the town hall for the women of Dusty Creek and the surrounding ranches who had not had the opportunity of formal education when they were young, and who were interested in reading or writing or basic arithmetic. She charged nothing, and she asked nothing except attention and effort, and she got both, because the women of this community were, as a group, already doing the work that civilization requires and needed only the tools that circumstances had previously denied them. Nathan rode her into town for the Friday sessions and picked her up 2 hours later, which he considered the best use of any Friday afternoon in his week, because he could stop at Wilder's for whatever the ranch needed and then wait on the steps of the town hall and watch Annie come out animated and precise and entirely herself, and feel, every single time, the thing he had felt the first time he kissed her, which was the feeling of something coming exactly right. Henry Wilder died in the spring of 1892, at 81, peacefully and in his own bed, which was exactly what he would have wanted, and the town mourned him in the complete way of small communities that have kept their human inventories close. His store passed to his daughter Margaret, who ran it with a different style but equal competence. Annie wrote a letter for the occasion of his funeral that was read by Reverend Cole, a letter about the mourning with the chalk and the extra box, and what Henry Wilder's particular brand of quiet fairness had meant to a woman arriving alone in a strange place, and half the congregation found something to look at in the middle distance while they composed themselves. The summer of 1892 was hot and long and magnificent. James, now 7, had begun learning to ride in earnest, and Nathan took him out on Saturday mornings on a small, patient horse named Button, riding the perimeter of the east pasture and teaching the boy to feel the horse rather than just direct it. Clara Rose, 2.5 and tireless, was at this point the primary organizational challenge of the Rocking Bee household, not naughty precisely, but in possession of a complete personal agenda at all hours that required constant accommodation. She had decided that the ranch dogs, of which there were 2, an elderly cattle dog named Captain and a younger, more energetic one named Map, were her specific responsibility, and she managed them with an authority they seemed to accept without resentment. She also had strong opinions about which boots were appropriate for which conditions, about the correct way to hold a spoon, and about the injustice of being told it was time for sleep when she was not yet finished with the day. Annie looked at her daughter one August evening, Clara Rose standing at the kitchen window in her nightgown, looking at the lit-up garden with the expression of someone who has not yet conceded the day, and felt a laughter and a love so completely mixed together that they were indistinguishable from each other. "Time for bed," Annie said. "1 more minute," Clara Rose said. "That is what you said 4 minutes ago," Annie said. "Then 3 more minutes," Clara Rose said reasonably. Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway with James at his heels, both of them dusty and tired from the evening's work, and surveyed the situation with the expression of a man who knows better than to enter this particular negotiation uninvited. James, who had already learned something about timing, said nothing. "Miss Clara Rose Boone," Annie said, "it is bedtime." Clara Rose turned from the window with the dignity of someone making a choice rather than being compelled, and said, "All right," and went. James went behind her, and Nathan came fully into the kitchen and stood behind Annie and put his chin on the top of her head, and she leaned back against him, and they stood like that for a moment in the warm kitchen, while Mrs. Hatch's late summer jam sat in jars on the counter, and the stars were beginning outside the window, and the children were going to bed, and the ranch was at rest. "She is going to be extraordinary," Nathan said. "She is already extraordinary," Annie said. "The question is what direction." "Every direction," Nathan said, simultaneously. "God help us," Annie said, and meant it fondly. The years settled and built on each other. Jesse Drum left the Rocking Bee in 1893, not in departure from anything but in movement toward something. His mother's people, the Ute communities in the northwest of the territory, had been through the grinding injustice of the removal policies that had characterized the United States government's treatment of indigenous communities for decades, and Jesse had a role to play there that he had been postponing. He went with Nathan's blessing and a good horse, and the knowledge that the rocking bee would hold a place for him if he ever came back. He came back 3 times in the years that followed, each visit longer than the last, and each time Annie had the children around the table asking him questions about the land and the sky and the old ways of reading both, which Jesse answered with patience and care, and an openness that honored the asking. Theo Briggs became the foreman after Jesse's departure, capable and committed, and 2 new hands were brought on as the ranch continued to grow. Brothers named Cortez from a family that had ranched the Colorado land since before it was a state, who brought with them a knowledge of the land and the cattle that was deep-rooted and practical. Pete Calloway died in the winter of 1894, at 67 in his room at the Rocking Bee, with Mrs. Hatch beside him and Nathan and Annie and both children nearby. He had been declining since autumn, the body slowly deciding it had done its work, and he had spent his last weeks in the clear and peaceful way of a man who has nothing outstanding, no unfinished business, no unspoken thing. Nathan sat with him through the last night and held his hand and talked about the early days of the ranch when it was nothing but raw land and a plan, and Pete had listened with his eyes mostly closed, and a small, satisfied expression that said he remembered all of it and was glad. The grief was real and it was kept. Nathan did not speak about it easily, but he felt it fully, and Annie was with him in the particular way that she had become with him in everything present and steady, and not requiring him to perform grief in any way other than the way he actually felt it. Mrs. Hatch kept the kitchen and the garden in Pete's honor and in her own grief, finding in the work the thing that keeps people moving when movement is the only answer. James was 9 when Pete died, old enough to understand loss and to feel it, and he was quiet for several weeks in the way of a thoughtful child processing something large. He went to Annie one evening with a kind of formal purpose that he had when he was approaching something serious and said, "Will you tell me more about Pete? Everything you know." And Annie sat with her son for 2 hours and told him everything. How Pete had come to the ranch when it was nothing, how he had laid fence line in the winter cold, and kept the books and grown the kitchen garden, and danced with Mrs. Hatch at the wedding and named James as an honor he never said he felt but clearly did. James listened to all of it with his father's quality of full attention, and when it was done he said, "I want to be that kind of person," which Annie thought was the finest thing her son had ever said and was careful not to say so with too much weight, because some things you let settle into a person without pressing on them. The ranch and the town and the life continued to grow and change and become. Dusty Creek grew through the 90s, with a new school building replacing the old one by 1895, 2 rooms now, with a proper stove and enough windows, and a real doctor's office for Dr. Alderman, who had been working out of his house for 20 years and deserved better. The railroad came within 15 miles of town in 1896, which changed the cattle business significantly and brought new people and new goods, and a connection to the world that was both welcome and complicated. Annie expanded her Friday teaching sessions into a more formal arrangement, working alongside the school board to create a program for adult education that became a model that other frontier towns took note of. She was asked in 1897 to write about the program for a Colorado educational journal, and she did, in the plain and precise way she brought to everything, and it was read by people who used it as a template for similar programs in 4 other counties. Nathan read the published article at the kitchen table and looked up at her with an expression of pride so complete that it made Annie briefly uncomfortable and then completely not, because it was true and unperformative and simply how he felt. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. She took the journal from him and set it in the bookcase beside Robinson Crusoe, which was still there, slightly more battered but holding together, along with years of accumulated titles that had made their way into the ranch house through one channel or another, filling the shelves Nathan had built and two more he had added since. James turned 13 in 1898 and was by then a fully realized person in the way of some children who arrive at themselves early, quiet like his father in the way he held things, precise like his mother in the way he expressed them, with a natural ease in the physical world of the ranch, and a serious interest in the natural sciences that he pursued through reading and observation with a methodical patience that was, if Annie was honest about it, more disciplined than her own had been at that age. Clara Rose was 9, and had been confirmed in the full measure of the extraordinariness her parents had predicted, bright and headstrong and generous, with a gift for reading people that made her, in various situations, either charming or dangerous, often both simultaneously. She had decided she would be a doctor, which she announced at supper one evening with the certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than expressing an aspiration. Nathan had looked at Annie across the table. Annie had looked back. "Then you will need a great deal of education," Annie said, "which you are capable of." "I know," Clara Rose said, and went back to her potatoes. Nathan caught Annie's eye again, and the thing that passed between them in that look was everything. The years, the choosing, the building, the grief and the laughter and the ordinary extraordinary days, and the children in front of them who were becoming themselves with a completeness that justified every hard thing that had preceded their existence. There was a letter in the fall of 1898, the last they ever received from Richard Calder, though they did not know at the time it would be the last. It came addressed to Annie at the Rocking Bee, finding her through the postal office, which now knew exactly who she was, and it was brief and formal, and said that he had married a woman in Chicago in 1885 and that they had 3 children and that he wished the Boone family well. He did not ask for anything or explain why he had written, and Annie read it twice and then handed it to Nathan, who read it and gave it back. "What do you want to do with it?" he said. Annie thought for a moment. "I want to note that it is closed," she said, "and put it away." She put it in the writing desk drawer, which was the correct place for closed things that do not need to be kept prominently but should be acknowledged. Then she closed the drawer, and they went to supper. The 20th Century came to Dusty Creek on a New Year's Eve celebration at the town hall that brought more people than the room technically held, which no one minded. Annie and Nathan danced to Archie Hayes's son, who now played the fiddle because Archie had passed the instrument to him along with the enthusiasm, and the son had clearly also inherited more technical skill, which improved the experience considerably. James danced with Rosa Gutierrez's younger sister, who was visiting from Santa Fe, a composed and lovely young woman of 15, in the careful and formal way of a boy of 14, who is not yet sure what any of this means but is paying very close attention. Clara Rose danced with everyone in the room who was willing, which was most of them. Nathan held Annie on the dance floor as the year turned, the new century arriving like a guest who had been coming a long time and finally knocked, and he bent his head to speak against her ear so she could hear him above the fiddle and the voices. 16 years ago you stepped off a stagecoach in the middle of this town with a suitcase and a secret," he said, "and I was not there to see it, which I count as one of the few genuine regrets of my life." Annie laughed against his shoulder. "You were 4 miles east, struggling with a difficult calving season." "I should have had better timing," he said. "You had perfect timing," she said. "You came exactly when you were supposed to." He pulled back just enough to look at her, and she looked at him. And they were both older now, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver beginning at his temple, the way they each knew the other's face, the way you know a landscape you have lived in for a long time, with the particular intimacy of daily attention. And none of it had changed the fundamental thing, which was that Nathan Boone and Annie Prescott had looked at each other in the middle of a frontier general store, and something had recognized something. And 16 years of daily choosing had made that recognition into a life. "Happy New Year," he said. "Happy New Century," she said, and kissed him there on the dance floor, and Clara Rose, who was 9 years old and watching from the side of the room, made the face of a child who finds this kind of thing excessive, and James, who was 14 and watching from the other side of the room, made the face of a person who has recently started to understand what that kind of thing means. Mrs. Hatch, dancing with the sheriff's deputy in the corner, saw it and was satisfied. The ranch ran on into the new century with the steady momentum of something well-built and well-maintained. The cattle and the horses and the land, and the people who tended them. Theo Briggs married a woman named Frances in 1901 and built a small house on the south edge of the property, adding a family to the Rocking Bee community that had always been, in the truest sense, more than a business. James went east in 1904, at 19, to study natural sciences at a university in Denver that had expanded its program significantly in the recent years. He went with his mother's methodical preparation, and his father's steady confidence, and both of their love in a form they could pack into a trunk, alongside his winter coat and his textbooks. In the letters that followed him there, in the knowledge that he could come home whenever he needed, in the certainty that home would be exactly what it had always been when he arrived. He came back for Christmas and for summers, and the ranch filled up again with the particular energy of a young man in his 20s discovering what he is capable of. And Nathan taught him everything that could only be learned in the field. And Annie read his papers and argued with him about methodology and the discipline of evidence in a way that he clearly found both infuriating and irreplaceable. Clara Rose, at 16 in 1905, was the most academically driven student Miss Ford. And by then Miss Ford had become Mrs. Torres, wife of Sheriff Gil Torres, and was still teaching and was emphatic about continuing to do so, had ever encountered. She read medical journals that Nathan acquired for her from Denver through a subscription arrangement that no one could quite remember who had initiated. And she asked Dr. Alderman questions that occasionally stumped him, which he regarded as the most interesting development of his professional practice in several years. Annie sat with her daughter many evenings and talked about the path, the difficulty of it for a woman who wanted to practice medicine in an era when it was not impossible, but was consistently harder than it ought to be, the way forward that existed regardless, the schools that were accepting women, the will and the preparation required. Clara Rose absorbed all of it with the expression of a person taking detailed notes on a problem they have every intention of solving. "I am not afraid of hard," Clara Rose said. "I know," Annie said. "You come by it honestly." Nathan, passing through the room on his way to somewhere else, heard this exchange and stopped in the doorway for a moment. Annie looked up and met his eyes across the room, and what passed between them in that moment was everything they had ever built together, carried in a glance, held between two people who had chosen each other every day for 21 years and intended to keep choosing. Jesse Drum came back to the Rocking Bee for an extended visit in the spring of 1906, and he was grayer at the temples and quieter in a way that held more rather than less. And he sat on the porch in the evenings with Nathan, and they talked about the land, and the years and the ways things had changed and not changed. He told Nathan about the Ute communities and the ongoing struggle for land rights and fair treatment that had characterized the relationship between those communities and the government for the entire duration of any of their lives. And Nathan listened with the full attention he brought to things that mattered and asked questions that were honest, and felt the weight of an injustice that was large and old, and not his to have created, but belonging to the world he inhabited, and therefore not entirely separate from his responsibility. Jesse said, before he left for the Northwest again, that the Rocking Bee was the kind of place that made the concept of home make sense, and that Nathan was the kind of man who built things that held, and that Annie was the kind of woman who made those things worth building. Nathan shook his hand and Annie embraced him, and Clara Rose, 17 and already practicing the composed professional manner she was building, shook his hand too, and asked him 3 intelligent questions about medicinal plants used by the Ute people, which Jesse answered thoroughly and with visible respect for the quality of the asking. James came home in the summer of 1908, his studies completed, and he came back different in the way that people come back from the places that have shaped them, more fully himself. The essential qualities deepened rather than changed, with a specific and serious commitment to land management and soil science that he wanted to bring to the ranch. He and Nathan had long conversations in the evenings about the practical and the theoretical. Nathan's decades of direct experience and James's formal training, meeting in the middle and finding that they confirmed rather than contradicted each other, which was deeply satisfying to both. James also came back with a quiet affection for a young woman named Helena Cortez, the daughter of the brothers who had worked the ranch for 15 years, and it developed through that summer in the unhurried way of two people who have known each other peripherally for years and are now, for the first time, seeing each other directly. Nathan watched it happen with the particular awareness of a father who recognizes something he knows. He said to Annie one evening, "James and Helena." "I see it," Annie said. "Good," Nathan said. They said nothing more about it, because they were both people who knew the value of letting things develop without pressure. James and Helena had their own story to write, and it would be theirs. Clara Rose left for Denver in September of 1908, at 19, to begin her medical studies. The women's medical school she attended was small and serious and demanding, and she met it with everything she had, which was considerable. She came home for Christmas and was visibly tired and visibly alive in a way that suggested she was exactly where she was meant to be. She told her parents about her courses, about her instructors, about the other women in her cohort, bright, determined, variously extraordinary, and Nathan and Annie listened and asked the right questions and did not say how proud they were in words because it would have been inadequate. They said it in the asking, in the listening, in the quality of attention. Nathan turned 55 in 1909 and Annie 49, and the rocking bee was as solid as anything in Colorado, a real ranch, a real community, a real home. The children were becoming their own people with their own lives, and the marriage at the center of it all was what it had always been, which was the truest and most permanent thing either of them had ever built. They had a habit by then of walking the west pasture in the evening, when the day's work was done, and the light was doing what it did over the mountains. The two of them side by side, not always talking, sometimes just walking in the comfortable silence of people who have enough between them that silence is a form of conversation. Nathan's hair was fully silver now at the temples and Annie's had silver threads through the dark, and neither of them looked like the young people who had stood in a general store in 1883 and nearly walked into each other, and both of them were more completely themselves than those young people had been, which was as it should be. On an evening in October of 1909, they stopped at the spot in the west pasture where the creek made a bend, and you could see the full range of the mountains in one view north to south, the whole extraordinary wall of them, purple and white in the fading light, and Nathan said, "I'm glad Dahlen came back empty-handed." Annie turned to look at him. "That is a specific thing to be glad about." "It is," he said, "because if Calder had not sent someone, I might not have found out so quickly that there was something to protect, and if there had not been something to protect, I might have taken longer to say what needed saying." "You said it quite directly," Annie said. "I said unpack both," Nathan said, which was not, in retrospect, the most romantic declaration in the history of the territory. "It was the most useful one," Annie said. Which, from where I was standing, was considerably better than romantic. She took his hand, which she had done thousands of times, and which still felt like a specific and chosen thing. "It was the first time I understood that you meant to be with me in it, not around it, in it." "Yes," Nathan said, "that's what I meant." The mountains went from purple to the deep blue of full evening, and the first stars appeared in the east, and the creek made its endless patient sound, and the ranch behind them was lit and warm and full of people who were part of what they had made Mrs. Hatch in the kitchen, Theo and Francis in their house, the new hands doing the evening work, James and Helena in the early sweetness of something beginning. Clara rose far away in Denver, becoming who she had always been going to become. Jesse somewhere in the Northwest doing necessary work in the way he always had. All of it real, all of it built, all of it held. I arrived in this town, Annie said, absolutely convinced that if I could just start over cleanly without anything complicated from before, I could manage whatever came next. And, Nathan said, and it turns out, she said, that you cannot start over cleanly. You bring everything with you. The suitcase and the secret and everything in between. She squeezed his hand. The only difference is who you carry it with. Nathan looked at her in the evening light, and he did what he had done for 25 years of loving her. He saw her completely, all the way in, without flinching and without distance, and she felt it, and she let herself be seen, which was the thing she had been learning since that first afternoon in the schoolhouse when she had told him about Richard Calder and he had said, quietly and without fanfare, "Unpack both." He raised their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and Annie turned to face the mountains with him, and they stood in the last of the daylight with the whole of their life behind them and the stars arriving overhead, and neither of them needed to say anything more, because everything had already been said in the choosing, and in the staying, and in the 26 years of daily love that had turned two careful, wounded people into the truest thing either of them had ever known. The rocking bee was quiet as darkness came on. The cattle settled in the pasture. The horses stood in the paddock with their heads low. The creek ran over its stones with the sound that it had always made, before any of them were here and continuing after, marking time in the only way that water knows, constant and moving, and entirely without concern for what was past. Annie Prescott had arrived in Dusty Creek with a suitcase and a secret, and a cowboy had told her to unpack both, and she had, and what came out of the unpacking was this: a life so full and real and warm that on October evenings it stood in the west pasture and watched the stars come out over the Rocky Mountains and called itself, without any qualification or reserve, home.